The crowd at the Billings auction laughed when the skeletal German Shepherd was wheeled out for the rendering plant. But when a bankrupt rancher raised his paddle to bid his very last $340, the laughter turned to ridicule. They called him a fool for wasting mortgage money on a walking carcass. They didn't know that Lot 89 wasn't just a stray. He was a decorated military working dog who had hunted IEDs in Helmand province, the same dust where the rancher's son had died. What happened next didn't just save a dog, it forced a judgmental town to its knees. Because when the August wildfires trapped the community's children in a wall of smoke, the useless dog didn't cower. He went back to work. And the secret he was carrying in his service record would eventually deliver a message from the grave that the rancher had waited 4 years to hear. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. Cruelty often hides in the noise of commerce. It's in the way men check their watches while a living thing shakes with fear, or how they crack jokes to drown out the smell of desperation. That August afternoon, the Billings livestock auction was a pressure cooker of heat, manure, and diesel fumes. Outside, a drought-stricken Montana baked under 97-degree sun. Inside, the air was thick with sweat and the rapid-fire chant of the auctioneer selling off cattle by the pound. Wade Hollister stood in the back shadows, clutching a foreclosure notice that was 3 days old. He had just sold his last breeding heifers to buy his ranch another month of life. The rhythm of the sale was hypnotic until it shattered. 2 handlers dragged a rusted cage into the ring. Inside sat a black and tan German Shepherd, ribs carving hard lines against his fur, his left ear torn. He didn't beg. He sat with the stoic, hollow-eyed resignation of a soldier who has stopped fighting. Going to the rendering plant unless someone wants to waste the gas money, the auctioneer sneered. The crowd chuckled. But Wade's hand, calloused and trembling, slowly raised his paddle. The heat in Billings didn't just sit on you, it hunted you down. It was mid-August in Montana, a bone-dry 2024 summer where the thermometer had been pinned above 95 degrees for 3 weeks straight. The air inside the Billings livestock auction barn tasted of pulverized manure, diesel exhaust, and the copper tang of anxiety. Wade Hollister leaned against the back railing, his hat pulled low to shield his eyes from the suspension lights that buzzed like angry hornets. At 58, Wade felt older than the weathered fence posts lining his property. His knuckles were white as he gripped the auction paddle, his hands calloused and scarred from a lifetime of fighting the land, a fight the land was currently winning. In the breast pocket of his snap-button shirt, a folded letter burned against his chest. It wasn't a love letter. It was a foreclosure notice from the bank giving him 30 days to come up with $28,000, or the Hollister Ranch, the dirt his grandfather had bled for, would be sold to the highest bidder. Below him in the sale ring, the auctioneer's chant was a rhythmic blur, a rapid-fire auction of livelihoods. Sold. $5,200 to bidder 147. Wade let out a breath that rattled in his chest. That was it. His last 6 breeding heifers. The foundation of his herd, the genetics he'd spent 10 years refining, were gone. $5,200. It was enough to keep the lights on and the mortgage paid for another 90 days, but it wasn't salvation. It was just a stay of execution. He should have turned around and walked out. He should have taken that check, driven straight to the bank, and bought himself another 3 months of misery. But his boots felt lead-heavy, rooted to the concrete floor. Clear the ring, the auctioneer barked, his voice losing the musical lilt reserved for prime stock. All right folks, settle down. We got a late add-on. Lot 89. The heavy steel gates clanged open, but no livestock trotted out. Instead, 2 ringmen wheeled in a rusted, wire mesh transport cage that looked like it had been salvaged from a scrap heap. The chatter in the bleachers, usually a low hum of cattle prices and weather complaints, died out. It was replaced by a confused silence, then the shifting of boots on aluminum. Inside the cage sat a German Shepherd. He was massive, or at least his frame suggested he should be. But as the ringmen opened the cage door and dumped him onto the sawdust, the dog looked like a ghost draped in black and tan fur. His ribs jutted out like the hull of a wrecked ship. His left ear was torn, the top third missing, leaving a jagged edge of scar tissue. He didn't pace. He didn't cower. He didn't bark. He simply stood up, legs trembling from weakness, and looked at the crowd. His eyes were what stopped Wade cold. They weren't the frantic, pleading eyes of a stray begging for a scrap. They were dull, flat, and utterly resigned. They were the eyes of a creature that knew exactly what was coming and had decided it wasn't worth the energy to fight it. Lot 89, the auctioneer announced, waving his hand dismissively at the animal. Male shepherd. No papers. No chip. Unclaimed county impound. Jensen's rendering is picking up at 4 o'clock unless someone wants to save me the paperwork. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. It wasn't joyful. It was that harsh, nervous sound men make when they see something broken and want to distance themselves from it. $5? Someone shouted from the front row. I'll give you $5 if you shoot him out back and save us looking at him. More laughter. Crueler this time. Come on now, the auctioneer said, though he didn't suppress a smirk. Let's start at 50. Anyone want a yard dog? He looks like he doesn't eat much. Wade stared at the dog. The animal hadn't flinched at the laughter. He stood with a strange, unnatural stillness, his weight balanced despite his emaciation. And suddenly the auction barn melted away. The smell of manure was replaced by the smell of antiseptic and old grief. Wade wasn't looking at a dog anymore. He was looking at a screen, a pixelated video call from 4 years ago. He was looking at his son, James. In that last call before the silence, James had looked just like this. Hollowed out. The youthful spark gone, replaced by a 1,000-yard stare that saw things Wade couldn't imagine. James had been 23, but he looked 40. He had stood with that same rigid tension, trying to hold himself at attention while his soul was crumbling. I'm tired, Dad, James had said. I'm just real tired. James had come home in a flag-draped box 3 weeks later. Wade hadn't been able to save him. He hadn't been able to pull him out of that desert or take away the weight that had crushed him long before the IED did. Going once, the auctioneer droned, bored. Going to the rendering plant. The dog turned his head. For a split second, those flat, dead eyes locked onto Wade's. There was no begging in them. Just recognition. I know this place, the eyes seemed to say. I know the end of the line. Wade's hand moved before his brain could stop it. He shoved his paddle into the air. $340, Wade said. His voice was gravel, barely loud enough to carry, but it cut through the room like a gunshot. The auctioneer froze. The crowd turned, necks craning to see who had spoken. 300, did I hear 340? The auctioneer squinted into the shadows. Wade? That you? 340, Wade repeated, louder this time. It was every dollar of cash he had in his wallet, the grocery money, the gas money, the emergency fund. Wade, you feelin' all right? A neighbor, Cal Miller, called out from 2 rows down. That dog's half dead. You throwin' good money after bad? He's meat, Wade, another voice yelled. Let him go. The ridicule washed over him, hot and prickly, but Wade didn't lower his arm. He couldn't. If he lowered his arm, he was letting James die all over again. He was agreeing with the world that broken things were garbage. Sold. The gavel cracked against the podium with a violence that made the dog blink. Sold for $340 to bidder number, hell, to Wade Hollister. The tension in the room broke into murmurs of disbelief. Wade's lost his damn mind. Grief finally snapped him. Buying a dead dog with foreclosure money. Wade ignored them all. He walked down the concrete stairs, his boots heavy, ignoring the eyes boring into his back. He approached the ring. The ringmen backed away, happy to be done with the trash lot. Wade opened the gate and stepped into the sawdust. He approached the dog slowly. Up close, the animal smelled of sickness and neglect. The dog didn't growl. He simply watched Wade's hands. Let's go, Wade whispered. He didn't have a leash. He pulled a length of baling twine from his pocket, looped it gently around the dog's neck and tugged. The shepherd hesitated, then fell into step beside him. He didn't pull, didn't drag. He walked at a perfect heel, his shoulder aligned with Wade's knee, matching the rancher's limping stride step for step. They walked out into the blinding August sun. The heat hit them like a physical blow. Wade led the dog to his battered 2008 Ford pickup, dropped the tailgate and lifted the animal. The dog was shockingly light, mostly fur and bone structure. He settled into the truck bed without a sound, lying down and facing the rear, watching the auction barn recede. Wade climbed into the cab and slammed the door, shutting out the world. He gripped the steering wheel, his hands shaking so hard he couldn't key the ignition. He stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror. The face staring back was gray-lined and hollow. The eyes were flat and tired. He looked at the dog through the rear window. The dog was staring at nothing, just existing. Yeah, Wade whispered to the empty cab. Me too, buddy. Me too. He started the truck. As he pulled onto the highway, the dog shifted. For the first time, the animal's ears perked up, swiveling toward the sound of a distant engine backfire. The dog didn't flinch. He didn't cower. Instead, he sat up, his body rigid, scanning the horizon with a sudden, terrifying intensity that didn't belong to a stray. It was a movement so sharp, so professional, that Wade almost hit the brakes. Whatever Wade had just bought, it wasn't just a dog. And as the truck rolled toward the ranch, Wade had the unsettling feeling that he hadn't rescued Lot 89. He had just invited a war into his home. The 40-mile drive back to the Hollister Ranch was an exercise in silence and second-guessing. The asphalt shimmered under the afternoon sun, a ribbon of heat distorting the horizon where the mountains met the pale, smoke-hazed sky. Wade drove with one eye on the road and the other on the rearview mirror. In the bed of the truck, the dog hadn't moved an inch. He lay curled against the cab, a jagged heap of black and tan fur that looked more like roadkill than a living creature. He didn't lift his head to sniff the wind. He didn't bark at passing fence posts. He simply endured the journey with the same grim stoicism he'd shown in the auction ring. Every mile marker that flashed by felt like an accusation. $340. It was a fortune to a man with negative equity. It was diesel fuel for the tractor. It was part of the property tax. It was groceries for 2 months. Now it was a dying dog in the back of a truck that needed a transmission overhaul. Wade turned off the county road and onto the gravel track that marked the boundary of his land. The sign at the gate, Hollister Ranch St. 1947, was faded, the wood gray and splitting, much like everything else these days. The property sprawled over 580 acres of rolling grazing land, but the drought had turned the lush pastures of Wade's memory into a brittle carpet of yellow cheatgrass and dust. The house sat on a rise overlooking the creek bed, which had run dry in July. It was a sturdy 2-story structure built by Wade's father, but neglect was beginning to show in the peeling white paint and the sagging front porch. Since Sarah died 8 years ago, maintenance had become something Wade did only when something actually broke. Aesthetics were a luxury for people who had hope. He parked near the barn, the engine shuddering before dying into silence. The quiet of the ranch usually comforted him, but today it felt heavy, oppressive. He got out and lowered the tailgate. "All right," Wade said, his voice sounding too loud in the stillness. End of the line. The dog didn't move. Wade reached in, half expecting the animal to snap, but the shepherd just went limp as Wade gathered him up. He was alarmingly light, his hip bones sharp enough to bruise Wade's forearms. Carrying him felt like carrying a bundle of dry sticks wrapped in a coarse blanket. Wade bypassed the house. He wasn't ready to bring this creature into the living room, into the space occupied by the shrine of framed photos on the mantel. James in his football jersey, James at basic training, James in his dress blues. The barn was neutral ground. He kicked open the door to the tack room, a space that smelled of old leather, sweet feed, and dust. He laid the dog on a pile of empty grain sacks in the corner. "Stay," Wade muttered, realizing as he said it how stupid it sounded. The dog clearly wasn't going anywhere. He filled a galvanized bucket with water from the yard hydrant and set it within reach. Then he poured a scoop of dry kibble, left over from the farm dog he'd buried 2 winters ago, into a metal bowl. The shepherd didn't even look at it. He lay with his chin on his paws, staring at the dust motes dancing in the shaft of light coming through the window. He was breathing, but only just. It was a shallow, efficient rhythm, the bare minimum required to sustain life. Wade stood there for a long moment, hands on his hips, waiting for some sign. A tail wag, a drink, a whimper. Nothing. He was looking at a machine that had been unplugged. "Suit yourself," Wade said gruffly. He turned and walked out, latching the door behind him. The evening chores didn't take long anymore. With the herd sold down to nothing, there wasn't much to do but check the perimeter fences and fix a broken hinge on the equipment shed. The sun began to dip below the mountains, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. Wade found himself lingering near the barn wall as the twilight deepened. The silence of the house was waiting for him, the empty chair at the table, the TV he would turn on just to hear voices, and he wasn't ready for it. He sat down on an overturned bucket outside the tack room, leaning his back against the rough wood siding. He could hear the faint, dry rustle of straw inside. The dog was still there, alive. "You know," Wade said, speaking to the air or the wall or the dying light, "they laughed at you today. But they don't know nothing. They see ribs and scars and they think trash. They don't know what it takes to keep standing when the whole world is trying to knock you down." He pulled a pouch of tobacco from his shirt pocket and rolled a cigarette, his fingers working by muscle memory. He didn't light it. He just held it, staring at the darkening fields. "My boy, James." He was 23. Wade paused. It was the first time he'd said the name out loud in weeks. Army Corporal. 1st Battalion. He was over there in the sand, just like where you probably came from. A soft thud from inside the barn. The dog had shifted weight. He was a good kid, Wade continued, his voice rougher now. Better than I deserved. He wanted to be a lifer. Loved the discipline. Loved the mission. Wade rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the grit of the day. Convoy hit an IED outside Lashkargah. That's what the officer told me. Said it was quick. Said he didn't feel a thing. Wade let out a sharp, bitter laugh. They always say that. It was quick. He didn't suffer. It's what they say to the fathers so we don't blow our brains out thinking about the truth. Inside the barn there was a scraping sound. A paw against the floorboards. The dog had moved closer to the wall where Wade was sitting. We fought, you know, Wade whispered. The confession clawed its way up his throat, painful and jagged. Before he deployed that last time. He was home on leave. He wanted to re-enlist. I told him he was a fool. I told him he was wasting his life fighting a war nobody cared about anymore. Wade closed his eyes, the memory burning bright and hot behind his lids. The kitchen table. The shouting. The way James had looked at him, disappointed, hurt, but stubborn. I just wanted him home, Wade said, his voice cracking. I just wanted him safe. But the last thing I ever said to my son was that he was wasting his life. We didn't talk for 3 months. Then the phone rang at 3 in the morning and 2 officers were standing on my porch and it was too late to take it back. Silence stretched out, heavy as the coming night. Then through the thin wood of the barn wall, Wade heard a sound. It wasn't a whine. It was a long, heavy exhale. The kind of breath a man lets out when he finally sits down after a march that went 10 miles too long. The dog was listening. You've heard this before, haven't you? Wade murmured, leaning his head back against the siding. You know that sound. Men talking to the dark about the ones who didn't come back. Wade sat there until the stars came out, hard and bright above the Montana plains. He felt a strange, tenuous tether forming through the wood and the dark. 2 broken things separated by a wall, breathing the same stale air. He eventually went into the house. He didn't eat dinner. He washed the dust off his face, drank a glass of tepid tap water, and lay down in the bed that had felt too big for 8 years. Sleep came in fitful snatches, broken by dreams of fire and sand. He woke at 0300. He always woke at 0300. It was the time the doorbell had rung 4 years ago. The time his life had officially ended, even if his heart kept beating. The adrenaline surge was familiar now, a cold spike in his chest that made going back to sleep impossible. Usually he would lay there and stare at the ceiling fan until dawn. But tonight the silence felt different. It felt occupied. Wade swung his legs out of bed, pulling on his jeans and boots in the dark. The house was cool, settling with creaks and groans. He grabbed his jacket and walked out the back door, crossing the yard to the barn. The moon was high, casting long, sharp shadows across the dirt. He eased the tack room door open, trying to be quiet, though he didn't know why. The moonlight filtered through the dusty window, illuminating the corner where he'd left the dog. The food bowl was untouched. The water level hadn't changed. But the dog wasn't sleeping. Ash was sitting up. He was positioned perfectly in the center of the room, facing the door. His ears were pricked forward, his posture alert, his front paws aligned. He wasn't resting. He was on guard. You don't sleep much either, do you? Wade whispered. The dog held his gaze. In the pale light, the scars on the animal's flank looked like topographical maps of bad country. Wade stepped inside and sat on an upturned crate. He didn't try to touch the dog. He just sat there in the gloom, keeping company with the only other soul on the ranch who understood what it meant to be awake while the rest of the world slept. But as Wade watched, he noticed something that made the hair on his arms stand up. The dog wasn't just watching him. Ash's gaze drifted past Wade to the window, then to the door, then back to Wade. He was checking the exits. He was clearing the room. And then, very slowly, Ash turned his head toward the far wall, where a rusted shovel leaned against the studs. A low, vibrating growl started deep in his chest. Not aggressive, but warning. Wade frowned and stood up. What is it, boy? Just a shovel. But Ash didn't relax. His hackles rose in a razor-thin line down his spine, and his focus locked onto something outside the window, something out in the darkness that Wade's human ears couldn't hear, and his tired eyes couldn't see. Morning broke over the ranch with a vengeance, the sun dragging itself over the eastern ridge like a slow-burning fuse. Wade had been awake since 3, but he waited until the light hit the barn roof to go back outside. Inside the tack room, the air was still cool. Wade checked the galvanized bucket first. The water level had dropped an inch. A small thing, barely a victory, but it was proof of life. The food bowl, however, remained a pristine mound of brown kibble, untouched. Ash was lying exactly where Wade had left him, eyes open, staring at the dust motes. He didn't thump his tail. He didn't lift his head. He just tracked Wade's movement with that unnerving, flat gaze. "Suit yourself," Wade muttered, kicking the doorstop loose. "Starving is a slow way to go, but it's your choice." He walked back to the house to brew coffee that tasted like battery acid. He was on his second cup, standing at the kitchen sink and staring out at the withered pasture, when a cloud of dust signaled a vehicle coming up the long drive. It wasn't a truck. It was a clean, silver sedan that looked terrified of the gravel. Wade's stomach tightened. He knew that car. Tom Garrett stepped out, brushing imaginary dust from his suit jacket. He was a decent man, the kind who coached Little League and sat on the church council, but right now he looked like an executioner who had forgotten his axe. Wade met him on the porch. He didn't offer coffee. "Morning, Wade," Tom said, not meeting his eyes. He looked past Wade toward the barn. "Tom, I was at the office early today," Tom started, shifting his weight. "Saw the transaction come through on the operating account. $340. Cash withdrawal at the fairgrounds." Wade crossed his arms. "Is there a law against spending my own money?" "It's not your money, Wade. Technically, it's the bank's collateral." Tom finally looked at him, his expression a mix of pity and frustration. "I heard about the auction. The boys at the diner, they're saying you bought that rendering plant dog. They're saying you bid against nobody just to throw the cash away." "I bought a dog," Wade said, his voice flat. "Didn't know the bank had a say in my pets." "You sold your breeding stock, Wade. That was your bridge loan payment." Tom stepped closer, dropping the professional veneer. "I've been holding the regional manager off for 6 months because I know your family. I know what this place means. But if you're blowing liquid assets on charity cases, I can't help you. I didn't ask for help." "You have 30 days, Tom said, his voice hardening. 30 days to bring the account current. That's $28,000. If you don't, I have to file the paperwork. The foreclosure process starts September 15th. I have no choice." Wade watched a hawk circle high above the dry creek bed. "I know the calendar, Tom." "Do you?" Tom shook his head, looking at the peeling paint on the porch railing. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've given up. And if you've given up, Wade, just tell me. Don't drag it out." Tom didn't wait for an answer. He walked back to his silver car, the suspension groaning as he navigated the ruts. Wade watched him go until the dust settled back onto the dying grass. 30 days, Wade whispered. He sat down heavily on the top step of the porch. The silence of the ranch rushed back in, louder than before. He had effectively traded his grandfather's legacy for a dog that wouldn't even eat. A soft scrape of claws on wood made him look up. Ash was standing at the corner of the house. He must have slipped out of the barn while Wade was distracted. The dog stood unsteadily, his ribs heaving with the effort of walking 50 yards. He looked at Wade, then at the empty driveway where Tom's car had disappeared. Slowly, painfully, Ash climbed the 3 porch steps. He didn't come to Wade for a pat. He didn't nudge his hand. He simply walked to the edge of the porch, turned his back to Wade, and sat down facing the road. He was taking up a post. "Well, Ash," Wade said, leaning back against the porch post and tipping his hat over his eyes. "I hope you're worth it, because I think we just officially hit bottom." They sat like that for an hour, 2 broken statues guarding a crumbling kingdom. Ash didn't relax. He kept his head high, ears swiveling like radar dishes, scanning the horizon. Around noon, another dust cloud appeared. This one was moving faster. A white SUV with a light bar on top. "Sheriff," Wade grunted. Ash's ears pinned back slightly, but he didn't growl. He just watched the vehicle with an intensity that unsettled Wade. Deputy Miller, Cal Miller's nephew, a kid barely old enough to shave, stepped out of the cruiser. He kept his hand near his belt, not on his gun, but close enough to make Wade bristle. "Mr. Hollister," the deputy nodded, keeping his distance. His eyes locked onto Ash. "That the dog. It's a dog, son. Not a mountain lion. You can take your hand off your hip." The deputy flushed pink but didn't relax. "We got a call, Wade. Couple of folks concerned about the situation out here." "The situation?" "The auction yesterday," the deputy stammered. "People are talking. Saying you were acting erratic. Aggressive. And now you've got an animal of unknown origin on the property. Just wanted to do a welfare check. Make sure everything's all right." Wade stood up slowly. His knees popped. "You tell the folks that I'm fine. I'm broke, not crazy. And tell your Uncle Cal that if he's got something to say about how I spend my money, he can drive out here and say it to my face instead of sending the law." The deputy shifted his feet, looking at Ash again. The dog hadn't moved a muscle, but his gaze was fixed on the deputy's center of mass. It wasn't the look of a pet wondering if it was getting a treat. It was the look of a predator calculating distance. "That dog aggressive?" the deputy asked, taking a half step back. "He looks unstable." "He hasn't moved except to get away from people," Wade lied. "He's half-starved. I doubt he's got the energy to bite you even if he wanted to." "Right. Well." The deputy tipped his hat, clearly anxious to be back in his air-conditioned cruiser. "Just be careful, Wade. You know the county code on vicious animals. If he snaps at someone, we have to put him down. No questions asked." "He won't snap," Wade said. He watched the cruiser spin its tires in the gravel, spewing stones as it sped away. "Funny," Wade murmured to the dog. "Everyone cares now. Everyone's worried about Wade's mental state. Nobody gave a damn when I was sitting here alone for 4 years. Nobody checked in then." Ash let out a short chuff of air through his nose, almost like he agreed. Wade reached into his pocket for his tobacco, his hands shaking slightly from the rage simmering under his skin. He was striking a match against his boot heel when a loud bang echoed from the county road, a mile away. It was just an old farm truck backfiring, a sound as common in Montana as the wind. But the reaction on the porch wasn't common. In the blink of an eye, the starving, lethargic dog vanished. In his place was something else entirely. Ash didn't flinch or cower. He didn't bark or scramble for cover under the porch. Before the echo of the backfire had even faded, Ash was on his feet. He dropped his center of gravity, his shoulders squared, his head snapping toward the source of the sound with mechanical precision. He didn't look scared. He looked ready. Wade froze, the match burning down to his fingers. He watched as Ash moved to the corner of the porch railing, keeping his profile low. The dog's eyes weren't wide with panic. They were narrowed, scanning the tree line, checking sectors. He looked back at Wade, then back to the threat, then back to Wade again, a clear, silent question. "What are your orders?" It lasted only 10 seconds. When no second bang followed, Ash slowly straightened up, though the tension remained coiled in his hindquarters. Wade shook the match out, dropping it onto the wood. He looked at the dog, really looked at him, for the first time. He saw the torn ear, the scars on the flank, and the way the dog stood, weight distributed for explosive movement despite his weakness. Most dogs heard a loud noise and saw a monster. This dog had heard a gunshot and looked for a target. "You weren't just a stray, were you?" Wade whispered, a cold chill running down his spine despite the midday heat. "You didn't learn that in a backyard." Ash looked back at him, and for a moment, the mask of the dumb animal slipped completely. There was an intelligence there, sharp and dangerous, buried under layers of trauma. Wade realized then that the vet, Dr. Chin, was the only person he could call. Because whatever was living on his porch wasn't just a rescue case. It was something that had been built, broken, and thrown away. And Wade needed to know what kind of weapon he had just brought into his home before it went off. Wade made the call from the wall phone in the kitchen, watching the dog through the screen door. Dr. Sarah Chin was the only vet in the county who would drive 40 miles on a Sunday for a client who owed the bank more than he owned in assets. She was a large animal vet, a woman who spent her days shoulder-deep in calving heifers and stitching up horses that had tangled with barbed wire. She wasn't the type to coddle a house pet, which was exactly why Wade called her. When her dusty white truck rumbled up the drive an hour later, Ash was still on the porch. He didn't bark. He simply stood, placing his body directly between the steps and the front door, watching the vehicle with that unsettling, calm intensity. Sarah hopped out, carrying her medical bag. She stopped dead at the bottom of the steps, her boots crunching in the gravel. "Jesus, Wade," she breathed, pushing her sunglasses up into her hair. "Where did you get him?" "Auction," Wade said, leaning against the doorframe. "Yesterday. Going to the rendering plant." Sarah approached slowly, extending a hand palm down. Ash didn't sniff it. He just watched her eyes. When she didn't retreat, he allowed her to step onto the porch, though his muscles bunched under his patchy fur. "He's starving, Wade. I mean properly starving." Sarah knelt beside the dog, her movements efficient and confident. "Let's see what we're dealing with." The examination was a study in tension. Ash didn't fight her, but he didn't submit. He stood rigid, enduring her touch like a soldier standing for inspection. When she lifted his lip to check his gums, Wade saw the first anomaly. "Hello," Sarah murmured, pausing. "Look at this." Wade leaned in. Among the yellowed canines, 2 of the upper teeth gleamed with a dull, silver luster. "Titanium crowns," Sarah said, tapping one gently. "These aren't standard. You see these on police canines sometimes. Keeps them from breaking their teeth when they bite into things. She moved her hands down the dog's ribcage, frowning. Her fingers traced the jagged scar running along his right flank, the one Wade had noticed in the truck. This isn't from a fence, she said, her voice tight. The tissue is puckered, burned at the edges. This is a blast injury, Wade. Shrapnel. Wade felt a cold stone settle in his gut. Shrapnel? And here. She ran her hands down Ash's left hind leg. Feel this. Wade crouched and touched the leg. The bone felt thick, uneven but solid. He's had a compound fracture, Sarah explained, pulling a portable scanner from her bag. Femur. But look at the set. She ran the wand over the leg, looking at the small screen. Surgical pins. And plates. This wasn't a splint job in a barn. This was an orthopedic surgeon. High-level trauma care. She stood up, dusting off her knees, and looked at Wade with a serious expression. Wade, someone spent thousands of dollars putting this dog back together. Tens of thousands. You don't do that for a stray. You don't even do that for a prize stud dog usually. Then what is he? Wade asked, though he was starting to suspect the answer. Let's check the ear. Sarah reached for Ash's left ear, the one with the torn tip. As she reached out, she moved a fraction too fast. In a blur of motion, Ash sidestepped. He didn't snap, but he swung his hindquarters around, effectively wedging his body between Wade and Sarah. He pushed Wade back a step, shielding him while fixing Sarah with a hard stare. Whoa, Sarah said, backing off. Okay. Message received. She looked at Wade, a strange softness entering her eyes. He's guarding you, Wade. I moved too quick and he puts himself in the line of fire. He's protecting his handler. I'm not his handler, Wade grunted, though his hand drifted down to rest on Ash's head. The dog leaned into the touch just slightly. Hold him for me, Sarah said. I need to see inside that ear. Wade gripped the dog's collar, dirty nylon that came from the shelter. It's all right, he murmured. Stand down. Ash exhaled and held still. Sarah flipped the ear back. The skin was pale and scarred, but there, inked in faded blue characters, was a sequence of numbers and letters. Or 219. Sarah stared at it for a long moment, then looked at the titanium teeth, the shrapnel scars, and the surgical pins. She let the ear drop. It's a tattoo, she said quietly. Military working dog identifier. The letter is the name code, the numbers are the last three of his social. Wade felt the blood drain from his face. He had to sit down on the porch swing. The wood creaked under his weight. Military, Wade repeated. He's a war dog, Wade. Sarah began packing her bag, her movements slow. That explains the medical care. The Army doesn't spare expense on their assets. If he was injured in combat, they would have flown him to a field hospital, done the surgery, rehabbed him. So why was he at an auction? Wade's voice trembled. Why was he going to a slaughterhouse? Sarah sighed, leaning against the railing. When they're decommissioned, it's complicated. If they can't be adopted out because of medical issues or aggression, what they call behavioral liabilities, they sometimes fall through the cracks. Or they get passed to a contract handler who doesn't care. It happens more than the military likes to admit. She looked at Ash, who was back to scanning the perimeter, his duty done. He's got PTSD, Wade. I'd bet my license on it. Hypervigilance, the startle response you mentioned, the detachment. In MWDs, it's usually triggered by a specific event. Loss of a handler is the big one. Loss of a handler, Wade echoed. They're bonded pairs, Sarah said gently. More than a marriage. They eat together, sleep together, work together. One holds the leash, the other clears the path. When the human dies, the dog often breaks. They lose their mission. They lose their reason to be. She didn't have to finish the thought. Wade looked at the dog, a weapon left without a trigger finger, a guardian with nothing left to guard. Can you help him? Wade asked. I can give you antibiotics for the infection in his ear. I can give you high-calorie paste to get his weight up. But the rest? She shook her head. The Army Veterinary Corps has resources, but if he's out, he's out. They won't take him back for rehab. He's retired, Wade. And in his world, retirement looks a lot like death. Sarah finished writing a prescription and handed it to him. Be careful. He's trained to kill things that hurt his person. Don't give him a reason to think anyone is hurting you. She walked to her truck. Before she opened the door, she called back. He's chosen you, Wade. I don't know why, but he has. Don't let him down. Wade watched her drive away until the dust settled. He was alone again. Just an old man and a broken dog on a dying ranch. He reached under his shirt and pulled out the chain he'd worn every day for 4 years. The metal tags were warm against his skin. Hollister James A. CPL. U.S. Army. He unclasped the chain and held the tags in his palm. The metal clinked softly. At the sound, Ash's ears swiveled. He turned his head, his nose twitching. He walked over to where Wade sat on the swing, his movements stiff but purposeful. He nudged Wade's hand with a cold, wet nose. Wade opened his hand. Ash didn't try to eat the tags. He sniffed them, inhaling deep and long, analyzing the scent of the metal, the sweat, the skin oils that had accumulated over years of Wade wearing them. He sniffed the silence that clung to them. Then the dog let out a long, shuddering breath. He looked up at Wade, and for the first time the dullness in his eyes seemed to crack. There was sorrow there. Deep, ancient sorrow. "You served too, didn't you?" Wade whispered, his throat tight. "You lost your boy too." Ash lowered his head and rested it heavily on Wade's knee, right beside the tags. It wasn't a cuddle. It was an anchor. Wade stroked the dog's head, his thumb tracing the ridge of the scar behind the ear. He felt the raised skin of the tattoo. R219. The number burned in Wade's mind. It wasn't just ink. It was a file. It was a history. And somewhere in the bureaucracy of the United States Army, that number was tied to a name, a unit, and a war that had taken everything from both of them. Wade stood up, the dog's head sliding off his knee. He walked into the house, but he didn't go to the kitchen. He went to the dusty roll-top desk in the corner of the living room where he kept his tax papers and the laptop he hadn't opened in 6 months. He needed to make a call. Not to the bank. Not to the feed store. He needed to call the number Sarah had scribbled on the back of the invoice, the contact for the Army Veterinary Corps Records Division. Because if Ash had been in the sand and James had been in the sand, Wade needed to know just how close their footprints had been. The bureaucracy of the United States Army was a fortress more impenetrable than any mountain range in Montana. For 3 days, Wade Hollister sat at his dusty roll-top desk, a phone receiver pressed to his ear, navigating a labyrinth of automated menus, hold music, and indifferent clerks. Outside, the ranch was baking under the relentless August sun. The grass was turning to straw, and the creek bed was a cracked mosaic of dry mud. Wade ignored it all. He ignored the unfinished fence line. He ignored the unpaid electric bill sitting on the counter. He existed only for the voice on the other end of the line. "Please hold for the next available representative." Ash lay under the desk, his chin resting on Wade's boot. The dog had started following him everywhere, a silent, limping shadow. He still wasn't eating much, just enough to keep his heart beating, but he had stopped trying to clear the room for threats every 10 seconds. Now he just guarded Wade. Finally, on the afternoon of the 3rd day, a human voice cut through the static. "Army Veterinary Corps Records Division. This is Major Linda Torres. How can I help you?" Wade straightened up, his back popping. "Major, my name is Wade Hollister. I'm calling about a dog. A German Shepherd I acquired, unexpectedly. He has a tattoo in his left ear." There was a pause, the sound of typing on the other end. "Go ahead with the tattoo number, Mr. Hollister." "Romeo. 219. Wade read it off the scrap of paper he'd been clutching for 72 hours. "Romeo 219, Torres repeated. "Hold 1. The silence that followed was heavy. Wade could hear the hum of the computer fan in his own kitchen, the ticking of the wall clock, and the slow, rhythmic breathing of the dog at his feet. "Okay," Torres said, her voice shifting from administrative to alert. "I have the file. Mr. Hollister, where did you say you are?" "Montana. Billings area. And you have the dog in your possession?" "Yes, ma'am. Bought him at a livestock auction 3 days ago. They were sending him to a kill shelter." "A kill shelter?" The major's voice sharpened. That is a massive failure of protocol. Our 219 shouldn't be anywhere near a civilian auction." "Who is he?" Wade asked, his hand gripping the edge of the desk. "His name is Ash," Torres said softly. "Tactical Explosives Detection Dog. Assigned to the 31st Military Working Dog Detachment." Wade looked down. The dog's ears twitched at the sound of his name, even through the tinny phone speaker. He lifted his head, eyes narrowing. "Ash," Wade repeated. The dog sat up, sliding out from under the desk to sit at attention. "He deployed to Afghanistan, Helmand Province, from October 2018 to March 2020, Torres continued, reading from the screen. "Participated in over 40 confirmed combat patrols. Credited with 12 IED finds." Wade's breath hitched in his throat. The room seemed to tilt. "Helmand Province," he whispered. My son was there." Corporal James Hollister. Same time frame. The line went quiet again. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Hollister," Torres said, the professional veneer cracking just enough to show the human beneath. "That was a bad time in a bad place." "What happened to the dog?" Wade asked. Why is he like this?" "Ash was involved in an incident on March 14, 2020, Torres said. His handler was Sergeant Marcus Webb. They were on a route clearance mission when their convoy was struck by a complex IED attack. March 14th. The date was branded into Wade's memory. It was 3 days before the officers had come to his porch. Sergeant Webb was Kia, Torres said gently. Ash was injured in the same blast. Shrapnel to the right flank. Ruptured eardrum in the left ear. He was medevaced to Bugram, then Germany. But the physical wounds healed better than the psychological ones. He developed severe handler protection aggression and anxiety. He wouldn't work for anyone else. He failed recertification 3 times. We had to decommission him in September 2020. "He lost his person," Wade murmured. "He did. And for a dog like Ash, that's fatal. We tried to place him with a contract handler stateside, but, well, the records get spotty after that. It looks like he was passed around. Adoption fell through. He shouldn't have ended up where you found him, Mr. Hollister. Someone failed this dog." Wade looked at Ash. The dog was staring at the phone, his body tense, vibrating with a low frequency that Wade could feel through the floorboards. He knew. He knew they were talking about the war. "Major," Wade said, his voice trembling. "My son was with the 1st Battalion, 6th Marines, attached to the task force in Helmand. Is there any chance they work together? I can't confirm specific operational overlaps without digging into classified logs," Torres said. "But the 31st MWD detachment supported everyone in that sector. If your son was on patrol in Helmand in early 2020, and they needed a nose to find bombs, it's very possible Ash was out in front of him." Wade ended the call 5 minutes later. He sat in the silence, the receiver dangling from the cord. The dog was still sitting at attention, waiting. Wade stood up and walked to the bookshelf. He pulled down the heavy box he hadn't opened in 4 years, the box the military had sent back with James's things. He had looked at the uniform once, folded the flag, and then closed the lid. It hurt too much. But now he opened it. He dug past the medals, past the folded uniform blouse, until he found the digital camera James had carried. It was an old point-and-shoot, battered and dusty. Wade prayed the battery still held a charge. He plugged it into his laptop with a USB cable. The computer chimed, a cheerful sound that felt obscene in the quiet room. He clicked through the folders. Deployment. Base. Patrol. Hundreds of photos. James laughing with his squad. James eating MREs in the dirt. James looking tired, dirty, and alive. Wade clicked through them, his eyes blurring. And then he stopped. Image 409. It was a candid shot taken inside a dusty tent or a barack. James was in the foreground, cleaning his rifle, grinning at something off camera. He looked young. But in the background, slightly out of focus, sitting on a cot next to another soldier, was a dog. A black and tan German shepherd. Wade leaned in, squinting at the screen. He zoomed in. The image pixelated, but the details were there. The blocky head. The intense, dark eyes. And the left ear. It wasn't torn yet, but the shape was undeniable. Wade looked down at Ash, then back at the screen. "It's you," Wade whispered. "You were there." Ash stood up. He walked over to the desk, his claws clicking on the hardwood. He looked at the screen, just a glowing box to him, but then he looked at Wade. He saw the tears tracking through the dust on the old rancher's face. For the first time since the auction, Ash didn't just endure Wade's presence. He initiated contact. He stepped forward and pressed his chest against Wade's leg, leaning his full weight into him. He let out a whine, a high, mournful sound that had been trapped in his throat for years. Wade slid off the chair and onto the floor. He wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, burying his face in the coarse fur that smelled of dust and survival. "You knew him," Wade sobbed, the grief finally breaking the dam he'd built for 4 years. "You knew my boy. You were with him." Ash didn't pull away. He licked the salt from Wade's cheek, his own body trembling. In that moment, on the floor of a foreclosure-threatened ranch house, the bond was sealed. They weren't just man and dog anymore. They were 2 survivors of the same war, finally finding the only other person on Earth who remembered the same ghosts. Word traveled fast in a small town, faster than a prairie fire. By the end of the week, the rumor mill at the diner was churning at full capacity. "Saw him talking to it," Cal Miller told the waitress, shaking his head. "I drove by the south fence." Wade was fixing a post, and that mangy dog was sitting there, and Wade was having a full conversation with him. Like he was talking to a person. "He stopped haying the lower field," another rancher added. "Grass is burning up and Wade's sitting on his porch showing that dog pictures. I think the grief finally ate his brain." "Bank's gonna take the place in 3 weeks anyway," Cal muttered. "Maybe it's a mercy." Wade's finished. They watched from the windows of their pickups as they drove past the Hollister place. They saw a man who had given up on the future to live in the past. They saw a skeletal dog that should have been put down. They saw a tragedy. What they didn't see was the sky out west turning a bruised, sickly yellow. They didn't see the barometer dropping. And they didn't notice that while the town gossiped about a crazy old man and his worthless dog, the wind had shifted. The drought had turned the national forest into a tinderbox, and 40 miles away, a dry lightning storm was building over the mountains. The clouds weren't bringing rain. They were bringing fire. And the only creature in the entire valley who could smell the smoke before it arrived was currently sleeping on Wade Hollister's porch, dreaming of burning sand. By late August, the Montana sky had turned the color of a bruised peach. It had been 47 days since the last drop of rain touched the soil of the Hollister ranch, and the land was holding its breath. The cheatgrass had bleached to a ghostly white, snapping like dry bones underfoot, and the air hummed with the static electricity of a drought that had gone on too long. The National Weather Service had issued a red flag warning at dawn: critical fire conditions. High winds, low humidity, and a heat index pushing triple digits. It was the kind of day where a spark from a dragging trailer chain could burn down a county. Wade was out on the western fence line, replacing a rotted cedar post. It was busy work, really, fixing a fence for a bank that was going to take the keys in 3 weeks anyway, but Wade needed the labor. He needed the ache in his shoulders to drown out the silence in his head. Ash was with him. The dog had filled out in the weeks since the auction. The high-calorie paste Dr. Chin prescribed had covered the worst of his ribs, and the infection in his ear had cleared, leaving only the jagged scar. But it was his movement that had changed the most. He didn't wander like a farm dog. He didn't chase rabbits or sniff at gopher holes. He moved with a distinct, unsettling purpose. As Wade dug the post hole, sweat dripping off his nose, he watched the dog. Ash had positioned himself on a small rise 20 yards uphill. He lay in the shade of a scrub pine, facing downwind, his head swiveling in a slow, constant arc. He checked the horizon. He checked the gully. He checked Wade. Then he started the cycle again. He wasn't resting. He was providing overwatch. Wade paused, wiping his forehead with a dirty bandana. He decided to test the theory. He picked up the heavy steel tamping bar and, without warning, let it drop onto the bed of his truck. Clang thud. The sound echoed like a gunshot across the valley. A normal dog would have jumped. A gun-shy dog would have bolted. Ash didn't flinch. In a blur of motion, he transitioned from a downstay to a standing alert posture. He didn't look at Wade. He looked outward, scanning the perimeter for the source of the threat. His ears were pricked forward, his tail high and still. He identified that there was no incoming fire, verified Wade was unhurt, and then looked back at his handler for orders. The discipline was absolute. "You're still in there, aren't you?" Wade murmured, leaning on his shovel. "You never really clocked out." Ash held his gaze for a moment, then returned to scanning the ridge line. The dog knew something Wade was only beginning to feel. The pressure in the air was changing. By late afternoon, the heat didn't break, it curdled. Dark, anvil-shaped clouds began to stack up over the Absaroka Range to the west. They looked heavy with rain, but Wade knew better. These were dry thunderstorms, the rancher's worst nightmare. They carried all the violence of a summer storm but none of the water. Ash began to pace. He whined, a high-pitched sound that vibrated in his throat, and trotted back and forth along the fence line, sniffing the wind. The scent of ozone was sharp and metallic. "I see it too, buddy," Wade said, throwing the tools into the truck. "Let's get back." They were halfway down the gravel drive when the first bolt struck. It didn't flash, it pulsed, a jagged vein of pure white light connecting the sky to the earth about 15 miles west, deep in the national forest. The thunder cracked a few seconds later, shaking the truck's suspension. Then another strike. And another. Wade pulled the truck over and killed the engine. He watched the ridge line. For 10 minutes nothing happened. Then a thin gray ribbon curled up from the trees against the dark sky. It looked innocent at first, like wood smoke from a chimney. But within minutes, the gray turned to black and the ribbon widened into a column. The wind was blowing hard from the west, pushing straight toward the valley. "God help us," Wade whispered. By evening, the smell of burning pine had reached the ranch. The sunset was a terrifying blood red filtered through layers of haze. Wade sat in his kitchen, the emergency scanner radio on the table crackling with the chaotic symphony of a disaster in motion. Dispatch, this is Engine 4. We have active crowning in the Box Canyon sector. Fire is jumping the firebreak. We need air support. Negative, Engine 4. Tankers are grounded due to wind shear. You're on your own. Ash was pacing the kitchen floor, his claws clicking rhythmically. He wouldn't settle. Every time the radio squawked, his ears swiveled toward the speaker. Then the tone changed. The calm, clipped voices of the firefighters were replaced by the frantic edge of the sheriff's department. All units be advised. Mandatory evacuation order for Box Canyon Road and Morrison Lane. I repeat, immediate evacuation. Fire is moving at 20 miles per hour. Wade stared at the radio. Morrison Lane. That was the Morrison Ranch, the biggest spread in the valley, about 30 miles west. Good people. A young family. The radio chatter became a blur of coordinates and panic. Families were loading horses in the dark. Trailers were jackknifing on narrow roads. Embers were starting spot fires miles ahead of the main front. Then a voice cut through the static, Sheriff Dale Hutchins, sounding breathless. Dispatch, I need a head count on the Morrison family. I've got the parents at the checkpoint, but they're screaming about a second vehicle. Pause. Then a new voice, distorted by tears and terror. My kids. They took the truck. They were right behind us. Wade leaned forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. Dispatch. The sheriff came back, his voice grim. We have 3 unaccounted minors. Ages 6, 8, and 11. Last seen driving a Ford F-150 on the North Access Road. Vehicle is not at the checkpoint. Wade looked at the map on his wall. The North Access Road ran right through the bottom of the ravine. If the fire jumped the ridge, that road would be a tunnel of smoke. Can we get a drone up? A deputy asked. Negative, the sheriff replied. Smoke is 00. Thermal is blinded by the heat signature of the fire. Ground crews can't go in blind. The canyon is a chimney. If those kids are in there, we can't see them. Wade looked down. Ash had stopped pacing. The dog was standing by the back door, staring west toward the glowing orange horizon. His posture had shifted again. The anxiety was gone. The pacing was gone. He stood with his chest out, his head high, his entire body vibrating with a kinetic energy that seemed to suck the air out of the room. He wasn't looking at the fire with fear. He was looking at it like a problem to be solved. Wade realized then what he was looking at. He wasn't looking at a rescue dog. He was looking at a biological sensor platform that had been engineered by the United States military to find needles in haystacks while people were shooting at him. Ash turned his head and looked at Wade. The look wasn't a question anymore. It was a command. I can do this. Wade grabbed his keys off the table. He didn't think about the foreclosure. He didn't think about the bank or the empty cattle pens. He thought about 3 kids alone in the dark, and the letter from his son that was still sitting in the box upstairs. Someone should find that dog. He's got more heart than any human I've met. You can find them, can't you? Wade asked, grabbing his jacket. Ash barked once, a sharp, deep, authoritative sound that Wade had never heard before. It was the sound of a soldier acknowledging an order. Wade threw the screen door open. Load up. Ash hit the truck bed before the tailgate was even down. Wade floored the accelerator, spinning gravel as they tore out of the driveway, heading straight into the orange throat of the storm. The radio was still screaming that it was impossible, that the smoke was too thick, that no one could navigate the canyon. But they didn't know Wade was bringing the only thing in Montana that didn't need eyes to see. Wade threw the last gallon jug of water into the cab, followed by a first aid kit and a handful of wet bandanas. The air at the ranch was already thick with ash, falling like gray snow, but as he drove west, the world turned into a monochrome nightmare of orange and black. The command post was a chaotic knot of flashing lights and shouting men at the junction of Box Canyon Road. Sheriff Dale Hutchins stood by the hood of his cruiser, a radio in one hand and a map in the other, trying to orchestrate a war against nature with insufficient troops. Wade skidded the truck to a halt and jumped out. Ash hit the ground beside him, instantly alert, ignoring the chaos of sirens and shouting deputies. Dale? Wade yelled over the roar of the wind. The sheriff looked up, his face smeared with soot. Wade, get back. This whole sector is blowing up. We're pulling the perimeter back 2 miles. The kids, Wade said, closing the distance. The Morrison kids. Did you find them? Dale wiped his eyes, leaving a streak of grime. No. The drone is blind. The ground teams can't breathe in there, let alone track. It's a zero visibility maze, Wade. They're gone. They're not gone, Wade said, his voice hard. I'm going in. Don't be an idiot, Dale snapped, stepping in front of him. You'll be dead in 10 minutes. Professional crews can't see their hands in front of their faces. I don't need to see, Wade said. He pointed down. He does. Dale looked at Ash. The dog stood at Wade's heel, vibrating with energy, his eyes locked on the smoke column rising from the canyon. That? Dale stared, incredulous. That's the skeleton you bought at the auction? Wade, this isn't the time for your... He's a military working dog. Wade cut him off, shouting to be heard over the rising wind. 31st Detachment. Explosives detection and combat tracking. He served 2 tours in Afghanistan. He's navigated sandstorms and smoke you can't imagine. He can find them. Dale froze, looking from the man to the dog. The desperation in his eyes warred with protocol. If I go in there, I need a scent, Wade pressed. Do you have anything of theirs? Dale hesitated, then reached into his cruiser through the open window. He pulled out a small pink backpack, the kind a 6-year-old takes to first grade. Found this in the parents' truck. Belonged to the youngest. Wade grabbed it. If we're not out in 2 hours, send a bird. If you're not out in 2 hours, Dale said grimly, there won't be anywhere to land. He stepped back. Go. And God help you. Wade drove the truck until the heat began to warp the air in front of the windshield. The road disappeared into a wall of roiling black smoke. He killed the engine. The sound of the fire was a physical weight, a deep, resonant roar like a freight train that never passed. All right, Wade coughed, tying a wet bandana around his face. He stepped out. The heat hit him like a hammer, sucking the moisture instantly from his skin. He knelt beside Ash. The dog was panting, but he wasn't scared. His ears were pinned back, his focus narrow. Wade held the pink backpack to Ash's nose. Smell, Wade commanded. Ash inhaled deeply, his nose working the fabric. He took the scent, strawberry shampoo, crayons, fear. Find them, Wade whispered. Seek. The transformation was instant. The limping, skeletal stray vanished. In his place was a weapon of war. Ash lowered his head, his tail stiffening. He didn't run. He moved with a fluid, stalking gait, turning directly into the smoke. Wade grabbed the dog's collar. It was the only lifeline he had. They plunged into the gray. Visibility dropped to 0 instantly. Wade couldn't see his feet. He couldn't see the trees. He could only feel the heat on his right side and the coarse fur of the dog's neck under his hand. Ash pulled him forward, weaving through the brush. Minutes stretched into an hour. Wade's lungs burned as if he were inhaling glass. His eyes streamed tears that evaporated before they hit his cheeks. He stumbled over rocks and fallen logs, but Ash never faltered. The dog was navigating a landscape of smell, reading the air currents that swirled through the canyon. Every instinct Wade had screamed at him to turn back, to run from the heat. But the tension in the collar kept him moving. Trust the dog. Trust the dog. Suddenly Ash stopped. Wade slammed into his hindquarters. The dog stood rigid, head high, testing the air. Then he let out a single bark. It wasn't a warning. It was a signal. Sure. Decisive. Ash dove to the left, dragging Wade down a steep embankment. They slid through shale and ash, tumbling into a dry creek bed at the bottom of the ravine. The air was slightly clearer here, below the smoke layer. Wade squinted through the gloom. Huddled against a rock overhang, 3 small shapes were pressed together. Ash was already there. He wasn't jumping on them. He was standing over them, barking rhythmically to guide Wade in. Emma? Wade croaked, pulling the bandana down. The oldest girl, her face streaked with soot and tears, looked up. She had her arms wrapped around her 2 younger brothers. Mr. Hollister? We're getting you out, Wade said, though as he looked up, his heart stopped. The fire had jumped the ridge. The orange glow was no longer just ahead of them, it was behind them too. The canyon walls were crowning. They were surrounded. Wade grabbed his radio. Sheriff, I have them. Sector 4, the dry creek bed. We are trapped. Repeat, we are trapped. The radio crackled, barely audible. Wait. I copy. We can't get ground units to you. The road is gone. Get a bird in the air. Wade screamed. Now. Chopper is 2 minutes out, but he can't see the LZ. The smoke is too thick. I'll mark it. Wade pulled the emergency flare gun from his belt. He looked at Ash. Guard. Ash moved instantly. He pushed the children back against the rock wall and then positioned his own body in front of them, a living shield against the falling embers and the heat radiating from the burning trees 50 yards away. The sound of rotors thumped overhead, muffled by the smoke. Wade pointed the flare gun straight up and fired. A streak of red phosphorus cut through the black, sizzling into the sky. "I see the flare," the pilot's voice cut through the radio. "Coming in hot. I can't land too tight." Dropping the basket. The wind from the rotors whipped the fire into a frenzy, sending a shower of sparks cascading down into the ravine. Ash didn't flinch. He stood like a statue, taking the heat, his fur singed by flying embers, keeping the children covered. A steel rescue basket descended through the smoke on a winch cable, swinging wildly in the updraft. Wade grabbed it, burning his hands on the metal. "Emma, get your brothers in," Wade shouted. He lifted the 6-year-old, then the 8-year-old. They were sobbing, terrified. Emma climbed in last, clutching Wade's sleeve. "What about you? Go." Wade signaled the winch. The basket rose, disappearing into the gray. Wade stood alone in the ravine with the dog. The heat was unbearable now, blistering his skin. The fire was 30 yards away and closing. "You did good," Wade yelled to Ash over the roar. "You did good." Ash looked up at him, panting, tongue lolling, but he didn't move toward the safety of the creek water. He stayed at Wade's side. The basket came back down. Wade scrambled in, dragging Ash with him. The dog was heavy, dead weight in his exhaustion, but Wade hauled him over the rim. "Take us up." The cable jerked and the ground fell away. They rose through the smoke, spinning slowly. The heat clawed at their boots, trying to drag them back down. And then they broke through. The transition was violent. 1 second they were in a suffocating oven. The next they were in the cool, clear air above the inversion layer. The sky was a terrifyingly beautiful tapestry of orange clouds and twilight. Below them, the canyon was a cauldron of fire. As the helicopter banked toward the staging area, Wade looked down at the command post. It was a sea of flashing lights. But beyond the police cruisers there were news vans, satellite trucks, cameras pointed skyward, telephoto lenses capturing the silhouette of a battered rancher and a scarred German shepherd dangling beneath the chopper against a backdrop of flames. Ash sat up in the basket, the wind ruffling his singed fur. He looked down at the world he had just saved, his expression calm, professional, and utterly unimpressed. The helicopter touched down in the field and the basket hit the grass. Wade rolled out, his legs giving way. Medics swarmed them. "The kids." Wade gasped. "They're safe, Wade." Dale Hutchins was there, gripping Wade's shoulder, his eyes wide. "You got them all." Wade looked for Ash. The dog had shaken off a medic who tried to check him and was limping toward Wade. He sat down next to the stretcher, placing a paw on Wade's chest. A camera crew from a national network pushed through the police line, their lens focused tight on the dog's face. On the torn ear, the military tattoo now visible in the harsh glare of the floodlights, and the undeniable bearing of a soldier who had just completed his mission. Wade closed his eyes, his hand resting on Ash's neck. The physical fire was behind them, but as the reporters began shouting questions about the hero dog of Box Canyon, Wade realized the quiet life he had tried to bury himself in was gone. The world had just watched a ghost come back to life, and the secrets buried in Ash's service record, and in James's letters, were about to become public property. And somewhere in the crowd, a man with a familiar unit patch on his jacket was watching the live feed on his phone, staring at the dog he thought had died 4 years ago. The waiting room of the Billings Trauma Center smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee, but Wade Hollister smelled like a campfire that had been doused with sweat. He sat on the edge of a vinyl chair, his hands wrapped in gauze where the rescue basket had burned his palms. Ash lay at his feet, his fur singed in patches, smelling of ozone and burnt pine. The dog hadn't moved in 3 hours, sleeping the deep, twitching sleep of total exhaustion. When the double doors swung open, it wasn't a doctor who came out, it was the Morrisons. Sarah Morrison's eyes were swollen red, her face streaked with tears she hadn't bothered to wipe away. When she saw Wade, she didn't speak. She just crossed the room and collapsed into the chair next to him, gripping his bandaged arm as if it were a life raft. "They're okay," she choked out. "The doctor said, just smoke inhalation. They're going to be okay." Her husband, Mike, a man Wade had known for 20 years, a man who had laughed along with the others at the feed store about Wade's bad investment, stood over them. He looked at Wade, then he looked down at the sleeping dog. Mike swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Your dog," Mike whispered, his voice cracking. "Emma said," she said he covered them. "She said the sparks were falling like rain, and he just stood over them and took it." "He was doing his job," Wade said hoarsely. "No," Mike shook his head, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. "We laughed at you, Wade. At the auction. We laughed at him." He dropped to one knee beside Ash, reaching out a trembling hand to hover over the dog's scarred flank. He didn't touch him as if the animal were made of holy glass. "I'm sorry. God, Wade, I'm so sorry." That was just the beginning. By the time Wade got back to the ranch the next morning, the world had shifted on its axis. The footage from the news helicopter had aired nationally. The grainy, zoomed-in shot of a battered German shepherd shielding 3 children in a ravine while a wildfire raged around them had gone viral before the sun came up. The headline on the local paper, tossed onto Wade's porch, read, "Forgotten War Dog Saves 3 Children in Montana Wildfire." Wade didn't have internet, but the town did. And the internet, for all its noise, was efficient at solving mysteries. Veterans forums lit up. Men and women who had served in the sandbox began analyzing the footage. The dog's discipline, the specific way he positioned himself, the visible tattoo in the high-definition freeze frames. 2 days later, a truck Wade didn't recognize pulled up to the ranch. A man in his 30s stepped out. He walked with a slight limp, favoring his left leg, and wore a faded Marine Corps ball cap. Wade met him on the porch. Ash, recovering and fed, stood by the screen door, ears pricked. "Mr. Hollister?" the stranger asked. "My name is Tom Delgado. I saw the news." "If you're a reporter," Wade said wearily, "we're done talking." "I'm not a reporter," Delgado said. He looked past Wade, his eyes locking onto Ash. His expression crumbled. "I served with the 1st Battalion in Helmand. 2019. We were clearing a route outside Marja." Delgado took a step closer, his voice thick with emotion. "We were walking into an ambush. A pressure plate daisy chain. None of our sweepers picked it up. But a dog did. A black and tan shepherd with a 31st Detachment handler." He pointed a shaking finger at Ash. "That dog hit on the trigger wire. He sat down right in front of the lead vehicle. Saved 6 of us that day." Ash let out a soft woof and pressed his nose against the screen. "That's him," Delgado whispered, tears spilling onto his cheeks. "That's our 219. We called him the Radar. I thought he died when Webb got killed." Delgado wasn't the only one. Over the next week, the stories came out of the woodwork. Men from Texas, Ohio, and Florida called the sheriff's office, identifying the dog from the footage. The useless skeleton from the auction house was slowly being revealed as a legend. The shame in Billings was palpable. It hung in the air thicker than the remaining smoke. The people who had mocked Wade for bidding $340 realized they had jeered at a hero. And then the penance began. It started with envelopes in Wade's mailbox. 10s and 20s mostly. Notes scribbled on napkins, for the dog, for the mortgage. I'm sorry I laughed. Then the online fundraiser started. 7 days after the fire, Tom Garrett, the bank manager, drove his silver sedan up the gravel drive again. This time he wasn't looking at his shoes. He was carrying a folder and he was smiling, a genuine, relieved smile. Wade was sweeping Ash off the porch. "If you're here to start the paperwork, Tom, I need another week." "No paperwork, Wade," Tom said, walking up the steps. He handed Wade the folder. Inside was a receipt. Paid in full. "What is this?" Wade frowned, his hands shaking. "Crowdfunding," Tom said. "The Morrisons started it, but it went national after the Marine verified the dog's identity. $45,000, Wade. In 4 days." Wade stared at the paper. The numbers blurred. 45,000? It covers the mortgage, the arrears, the property tax, and sets up a veterinary trust fund for Ash at Dr. Chen's clinic. Tom leaned against the railing. "The community wants to make it right." "I don't deserve this," Wade mumbled, feeling the heat rise in his neck. I just bought a dog." "It's not about deserve," Tom said softly. "It's about respect. For what you did when nobody was watching. And for what he did when it mattered." He looked at Ash, who was sleeping in a patch of sun. "You didn't save a dog, Wade. You recognized a soldier. The rest of us? We were just looking at the wrapping paper." Wade signed the release forms in a daze. The ranch was safe. The weight that had been crushing his chest for 2 years was gone, lifted by the very creature he had almost walked past. National organizations reached out. Magazines wanted interviews. A morning talk show wanted to fly them to New York. Wade turned them all down. "He's retired," Wade told the producers on the phone. "He's done his tours. He's earned his peace. We're staying home." The world eventually moved on to the next viral sensation, but the quiet that settled over the Hollister Ranch was different now. It wasn't the silence of emptiness, it was the silence of peace. Then a week later the delivery truck came. It was a government vehicle. The driver, a somber young corporal, carried a heavy, taped cardboard box to the porch. He requested Wade's signature, saluted smartly, and drove away. The return address was Department of the Army Casualty and Mortuary Affairs Operations Center. Wade stared at the box. He knew what it was. He had been told years ago that some of James's personal effects had been delayed, lost in a container shuffle during the chaotic withdrawal, stuck in a warehouse in Germany, tangled in red tape. He had stopped waiting for them. He carried the box into the kitchen and set it on the table. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the floor. Ash walked in, his claws clicking on the linoleum. He sensed the shift in the air immediately. He sat beside the table, resting his chin on the edge, his dark eyes fixed on the cardboard. Wade cut the tape with his pocket knife. His hands were steady, but his heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Inside was the smell of dust and old canvas, a pair of worn boots, a stack of DVDs, a beaten-up copy of a Louis L'Amour novel Wade had sent him, and at the bottom, a heavy manila envelope. Wade pulled it out. It wasn't sealed. The flap was tucked in, worn soft at the edges. He slid the contents out. Photographs, a journal, and a single letter folded into a triangle the way they used to do in high school. The date at the top of the page stopped Wade's heart. March 1st, 2020. 2 weeks before James died. Wade unfolded the paper. The handwriting was familiar, messy and rushed, scrawled in blue ink. He began to read, his eyes scanning the lines until he hit the second paragraph. The air left the room. The world narrowed down to the words on the page. Dad, I don't know if I'll ever mail this. We had another close call yesterday. IED on Route 611. Our convoy would have driven right over it, but one of the MWDs alerted. Wade's hand flew to his mouth to stifle a sob. He looked at Ash. The dog was watching him, his tail thumping once, slowly against the floor. A black and tan shepherd named Ash, the letter continued. Beautiful dog, Dad. Smartest I've ever seen. His handler, Sergeant Webb, says Ash has saved more lives than anyone can count. Wade read the line again and again. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just a dog his son had seen in passing. This wasn't just a coincidence of geography. He turned the page, his trembling fingers struggling with the paper, and there, at the very bottom, was a postscript that James had scribbled in the margin. A final request that reached out from 4 years in the past to grab Wade by the throat. The kitchen was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the wall clock. The light outside had faded to a deep, bruising purple, but Wade didn't turn on the lamp. He sat at the table, the single sheet of lined notebook paper trembling in his hands. The ink was blue, the handwriting messy, a rushed scrawl that Wade knew better than his own. It was the handwriting of a young man trying to get his thoughts down before the convoy rolled out. Wade took a breath that shuddered in his lungs and began to read. Dad, I don't know if I'll mail this. We had another close call yesterday. IED on Route 611. Our convoy would have driven right over it, but one of the MWDs alerted. A black and tan shepherd named Ash. Beautiful dog, Dad. Smartest I've ever seen. His handler, Sergeant Webb, says Ash has saved more lives than anyone can count. Wade lowered the paper. The room spun. He looked down at the dog sitting by his chair. Ash was watching him, his head tilted, his dark eyes reflecting the fading light from the window. Route 611. March 1st. Wade forced himself to look back at the page. Dad, I know you think I'm wasting my life out here. Maybe I am. But today, because of that dog, 12 of us are alive. If that's wasting life, I don't know what purpose means. If I don't make it home, someone should find that dog. He's got more heart than any human I've met. He deserves better than what happens to most MWDs when they retire. I know you take care of him. You've always taken care of the things everyone else overlooks. The tears came then. They didn't start slowly. They broke loose like a damn failure, hot and blinding. Wade doubled over, clutching the letter to his chest, his shoulders shaking with the force of 4 years of held-back grief. I love you, Dad. I'm sorry about the fight. I understand why you wanted me home. But I'm where I need to be. Jay. 4 years, Wade had been haunted by their last argument. He had believed his son died thinking his father didn't respect his sacrifice. He had believed James died angry. But the paper in his hand was forgiveness. It was absolution. And it had been delivered by the dog sitting at his feet. Ash moved then. He didn't jump up or whine. He simply pressed his heavy body against Wade's legs, anchoring him. He rested his chin on Wade's knee, letting out a long, heavy sigh. Wade reached down, burying his hands in the thick fur of the dog's neck. He felt the scar from the shrapnel, the shrapnel that had likely hit Ash only a few weeks after James wrote this letter. "You saved him," Wade whispered, his voice cracking. "Before he died, you saved him. He got to come home once because of you." The realization washed over him, cleansing the guilt that had stained his soul since the funeral. Wade hadn't just saved a random dog at an auction. He had completed a mission James couldn't finish. James had asked him to find this dog. He had asked him to take care of the guardian who had kept him alive for those extra weeks, giving him the time to write this very letter. "He sent you to me," Wade sobbed, pressing his forehead against the dog's head. He knew. The morning sun was bright and cold when they pulled up to the iron gates of the cemetery. It wasn't the large national cemetery, but the local veterans' plot where the county buried its own. Wade wore his best suit, the one he hadn't worn since the funeral. Ash was groomed, his coat shining, a new leather collar around his neck. They walked through the rows of white marble headstones. The grass was green here, watered and tended, a stark contrast to the parched ranch they had left behind. Wade didn't need to look for the plot. His feet knew the way by heart. He stopped in front of the stone. "James A. Hollister, CPO, U.S. Army, beloved son." Wade stood there for a long time, the wind tugging at his hat. Then he looked down at Ash. "Ash," Wade said softly. "Place." The dog didn't need to be told twice. He seemed to understand where he was. The scent of the place, the earth, the old flowers, the solemnity, triggered something deep in his training. Ash stepped forward and sat beside the headstone. He sat at perfect attention, chest out, ears forward, staring at the name carved in the marble. He wasn't guarding a perimeter. He was standing watch over a brother. Wade knelt in the grass. He took the letter from his pocket, now sealed in a plastic sleeve to protect it from the Montana weather. He placed it at the base of the stone, weighing it down with a smooth river rock from the ranch. "I got it, James," Wade said, his voice steady. "I got the message. And I got the dog." Ash leaned forward and sniffed the stone. He lingered there for a moment, his tail giving a single, slow thump against the grass. "He wanted me to find you," Wade told the dog. "Took me 4 years and a lot of luck, but I got there." Wade placed his hand on the cold marble, then moved it to rest on the dog's warm shoulder. "You're home now. Both of you." The town of Billings didn't just want to pay Wade's mortgage. They wanted to build a monument. 2 weeks later, the community held a dedication ceremony in the park. They were unveiling a memorial for the K-9 veterans of the county, a bronze statue of a shepherd, funded by the same donations that had saved the ranch. Wade stood at the back of the crowd, hat in his hands. He had refused to give a speech. He refused to sit on the dais. He just wanted to be there. The mayor spoke about heroism. The sheriff spoke about duty. But the only part that mattered to Wade was when the Morrison family stepped up. Emma, the 11-year-old girl Ash had shielded from the fire, walked to the microphone. She looked terrified until she saw Ash standing in the back. She smiled and the fear vanished. "We made this," she said into the mic, holding up a small glittery object. "For Ash." She walked through the crowd, which parted like the Red Sea. She came right up to Wade and the dog. Ash lowered his head, his tail wagging loosely. Emma tied a ribbon around his neck. Hanging from it was a piece of cardboard covered in tin foil, shaped like a star. Written on it in marker was simply, "Our hero." Ash accepted the honor with the dignity of a general accepting the Medal of Honor. He licked Emma's hand once, then returned to Wade's side, pressing against his leg. Wade looked at the crowd, the neighbors who had laughed, the banker who had threatened foreclosure, the strangers who had judged him. They were all clapping now. Some were crying. But Wade didn't need their applause. He looked down at the dog who had walked through hell in Afghanistan and fire in Montana, and who had chosen, out of all the people in the world, to walk out of that auction ring with him. "Let's go home, soldier," Wade whispered. That evening, the sun set over the Hollister ranch in a blaze of gold and violet. The smoke from the fires was gone, scrubbed from the sky by a hard rain that had finally come 3 days ago. The pastures were already showing the faintest green haze of new growth. Wade sat on the porch swing, a glass of iced tea in his hand. Ash lay beside him, his head resting on his front paws, watching the shadows lengthen across the valley. For the first time in years, the ranch didn't feel empty. It didn't feel like a graveyard of memories. It felt like a place where things could grow again. Wade reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the photo of James, the one with Ash in the background. He looked at the boy's grin, then at the dog's stoic profile. "You know," Wade said into the quiet, "everyone says I saved you." Ash rolled his eyes up to look at Wade, his eyebrows twitching. "But that ain't right," Wade continued, looking out at the fence line he still had to finish fixing. You didn't need saving, did you? You just needed someone to see you were still serving. Ash let out a huff of agreement and rested his heavy head on Wade's knee. His body was completely relaxed. The tactical tension, the constant scanning for IEDs and threats, was gone. He was off the clock. Wade ran his thumb over the dog's new collar. Next to the faded military tattoo in his ear, the new brass tag caught the last light of the sun. It didn't have a number. It read, S.H. Hollister Home. Wade leaned back, closing his eyes, and for the first time in 4 years, the silence wasn't lonely. Some debts can't be repaid, only honored. Some rescues happen twice. And sometimes, the one you save is the one who's been protecting you all along. Most people scrolled past this video just like the town scrolled past Wade. But you're still here. You're the one Wade was looking for. Like this video to show that loyalty still means something. Subscribe if you'd never leave a hero behind.